Welcome back to A Localized Journey, the series where we take a long, hard look at the localization of various games across time. Continuing our coverage of Pokemon Red, we've just saved Mr. Fuji from the clutches of Team Rocket and earned ourselves a Pokeflute. From this point, there are a few paths we could potentially take to progress the story of the game. The one I've chosen is to make a return trip to Saffron City and finish up the business we left undone there. If you know Pokemon, you'll know that means we're heading into the Silph Co building, where Team Rocket has once again taken over, and this is where the localization changes begin. The very first rocket we encounter says in Japanese, "Hey kid, stop wandering around." A pretty self-explanatory and easily understood sentence in English, but nevertheless, this was changed during localization to be, "Hey kid, what are you doing here?" The astute viewer will realize that the much more faithful translation is once again shorter in length than the chosen English localization, even further proving the point I've made several times that the changes in this game shouldn't be blindly defended with the notion that they were done to save on cartridge space. As to why this change was actually made, I'm honestly not too sure. If I had to venture a guess, I'd say the localizer just didn't like the way the more direct translation sounded, so he changed it. If that is in fact the reason for the change here, it's not a good one because it obscures the original intent of the Japanese game for nothing but personal opinion. Some may turn their noses up at a criticism like this, saying it's nitpicking and ultimately inconsequential, but in my opinion, if we open the gates even a little bit to arbitrary change during localization, it will overtake the game as it has in Pokemon Red. Moving away from the pre-battle dialogue, this rocket happens to have a Golbat, which is a Pokemon we have yet to talk about. Golbat's name was more or less unchanged from its Japanese name Gorubato, which is pretty rare for this game. The reason for this is most likely that some of the main origins for Golbat's name are easily understood by a Western audience. Those origins are the transliterations of the word ghoul or guru and bat or bato. To an English speaker, those origins are all you really need to see how the name makes sense, but in Japanese, things go just a bit deeper. In Japan, there's a traditional form of storytelling called kamishibai, or paper theater. It's an art form where a bunch of individual pieces of art done on paper are stacked on top of one another in a way that, as the pieces are removed, they show the progression of a story. This stack of paper is then usually placed in a box of sorts and used as a reference for a storyteller as they're telling a story. It's almost like a very rudimentary version of a TV. Now, at this point you're probably thinking, what does this have to do with Golbat? Well, a famous kamishibai story known as Ogon Bato is one of the origins for Golbat's name. Ogon in Japanese means gold or golden, so what the developers did was change Ogon into its English form gold, transliterate that into Japanese making it Gorudo, and then shorten it to Goru. Thus we ended up with Gorubato. Sure, it's a little convoluted, but it's definitely interesting. Next, we have a shorter one to keep things a bit fresh, and that is the lost dialogue of this rocket. In Japanese, he says, "Goo, I screwed up," which became "I goofed" in English. The word used for screw up here is shikujiru, which could be translated as to goof, but in this case, it just sounds a bit weird to me. The presentation of Team Rocket and Pokemon Red is one of an evil crime syndicate, so having one of its members say, "Boy, I goofed," doesn't really fit the theme in my opinion. It's just a bit too silly. Later on, we run into a man in a lab coat who challenges us to a battle. In English, this trainer type is obviously known as scientist, but surprisingly, this is pretty far off from the original name. In Japanese, scientists are known as Hagure Kenkyuin, or researcher gone astray. So not only were the researchers turned into scientists, the whole idea that these researchers have gone astray was removed from the English localization. This is yet another example of the English localization removing interesting details from Pokemon Red. This stray researcher has the evolved form of Magnemite in his party, which we all know is called Magneton in English. The Japanese name for Magneton is Rea Koiru, or rare coil. This name comes from the transliterations of rare metal, or Rea Metaru, and coil, or koiru. The coil being referenced here is the type of coil that produces magnetic fields, hence the appearance of the Pokemon. Next up on the localization chopping block is this rocket between two tables. In Japanese, he says, "This isn't a place for kids," which was changed to "No kids are allowed in here" in the English version of the game. In my opinion, the English localization is just weird here. It comes off to the player that Team Rocket has a rule or something that kids aren't allowed in the Silph Co building, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. The Japanese, on the other hand, simply implies that Team Rocket are up to no good in the Silph Co building, so it's dangerous for kids to be there. It makes more sense, and it fits with the theme of Team Rocket, so why was it changed? Well, these two sentences are the same length, so the idea that it was changed to save space is once again unsurprisingly out the window, which just leaves the opinion of the localizer. You hate to see it. The entire feeling and meaning of the original sentence was changed for nothing more than personal opinion. If I've said it once, I've said it 100 times, localizers should not inject their opinions into a localization. The intentions of the original creators should be put first in all cases. Later on, we come across a researcher who has an Electrode. This is our first time seeing one of these guys, so let's talk about its Japanese name. In Japan, Electrode is known as Maru Mine. The two obvious references here are to the Japanese word maru, meaning circle, and the transliteration of mine or mine. If you go to an English source, this is probably as far as you'll get, but there is one other origin here, and that is that the name Maru Mine is an anagram of the Japanese term man marui, meaning perfectly round. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the decision to completely remove the reference to Electrode's round shape for a few reasons. Number one, it messes up the consistency with the idea that he's the ball Pokemon or the sphere Pokemon. And number two, it was entirely possible to come up with a name that would include some sort of reference to his roundness in it. I'll give a few examples off the top of my head. How about something like Surkine or Balline? Even Raumine would have been fine in my opinion. Personally, I'm partial to Surkine because you get the added bonus of a reference to circuits, but really anything that just jams a word meaning round with mine would have been perfectly fine. These names also work better with Voltorb's English name because for some reason, the round aspect of his name was left intact while Electrode's was removed. Even more consistency problems. After the battle with the researcher, we run into a rocket with a wheezing, which is another first encounter for us. In Japanese, wheezing is known as mata dogasu. If you remember, the original name of coughing was dogasu, and in Japanese, mata means again, so it's pretty easy to see the main source of wheezing's Japanese name. However, there are a few other possible origins here. There's of course the obvious transliteration of gas and the Japanese term dokugasu, meaning poison gas that we talked about with coughing, but this time we also have the transliteration of mustard gas or masta dogasu. Lastly, there's the Japanese term futamata, which means forked, and also interestingly, to date two people at the same time. This rocket that we've been fighting is one of the so-called 4 Rocket Brothers. This is a group of rockets in this building that all have the exact same intro dialogue saying, "I'm one of the 4 Rocket Brothers," which was actually localized pretty faithfully. However, when it comes to their lost dialogue, that's a different story. This first Rocket Brother we encounter says in Japanese, "Older brother, I lost." This was localized to, "Woo, oh brothers." As you can clearly see, this is a rather drastic change made for seemingly very little reason. And the same can be said for the other brothers as well. Another of the younger brothers has the exact same lost dialogue as the previous brother, but it was instead localized to a different sentence in English, namely, "Ack, brothers, I lost." The next younger brother has slightly different lost dialogue in Japanese. They basically just cut out the older brother part, leaving him with just, "I lost." In English, however, this was changed to "flame out," for a reason that I don't think I'll ever understand. Lastly, there's the oldest brother who upon losing says, "Ugh, I lost, younger brother," in Japanese, which was localized to, "Warg, brothers, I lost." In Japanese, he appears to only be speaking to a singular younger brother, presumably the one you faced prior to the oldest brother. But in English, he's talking to all of his brothers. Actually, this is a change that all the brothers saw. In Japanese, the idea is that each brother is calling out to the next brother you'll face when they lose, but in English, they all just say brothers, making it feel like just an exclamation meant to be heard by no one in particular. In my opinion, this whole 4 brothers section of the script lost most, if not all, of the original intent of the Japanese version of the game, which is exactly the opposite of what a localizer should be aiming to accomplish. Moving on now to a rocket who isn't a member of the 4 brothers, we come across a guy who says, "Uh-oh, I found a little rat." In English, the localization of this is, "Oh ho, I smell a little rat." This change to smell from found once again seems to be a rather arbitrary change because there's any number of ways you could have localized the original word to be extremely faithful to the original and perfectly understood by a Western audience. All signs seem to point to unneeded localizer flair, which is something I really don't like to see. I'm sure you're all familiar with the way localizers sometimes like to try and spice up a script by adding in words they think are better or more interesting. We've seen several examples of this thus far in Pokemon Red, and every time I encounter one, it just makes me sigh. It's not a localizer's job to try and make a script, quote-unquote, more fun or more Western. Just make the game make sense in English and move on. It's not that hard. When this rocket loses, he says, "Gakushida" in Japanese. Gakushi is an onomatopoeia for someone falling over in defeat or disbelief. I'll put some images up on the screen to give you guys a better understanding of the circumstances it would be used in. Now, when it comes to the English localization, this was adapted to the phrase "lights out." Now, personally, I don't think the original Japanese translates super well into English, so some change is expected here, but lights out is just too far. Something simple like oof or shrug would have been perfectly fine. I'm sure there's better options, but that's just what came to my mind first. A bit further into Silph Co, we find a room filled with scared employees of Silph that is also filled with bad localization. The first guy we talk to in Japanese says, "Shiver, shiver, God, Buddha, save me." Now, just for some context, Japan is a country where religion isn't really at the forefront. The two main religions, Buddhism and Shintoism, aren't really mutually exclusive when it comes to the average person. Many Japanese people practice both Buddhism and Shintoism simultaneously in various ways. For example, when holding a funeral, a family will most likely call a Buddhist monk to perform various rites, but that same family may also go to a Shinto shrine to pray for their loved one that passed away. It's a religious structure that doesn't really align with the Western structure of religion. This intermingling of religions has led to various cultural outcomes, many of which manifest in language like we see here. This man calls out not only to a Shinto god or kami-sama, he also calls out to Buddha or Hotoke-sama. And this is a very common occurrence in the Japanese language. In my opinion, it's pretty amusing. It's kind of like they're just calling out to any and all gods that will save them from their current predicament. Like, I don't care who, just someone help me. Now, if past experience has taught us anything, we all know this plea to the gods was never getting past localization, and of course that's the case. In English, this is changed to, oh dear, please help me," which is not only not nearly as funny as the original Japanese dialogue, it's also way out of bounds for a faithful localization. I know it was the 90s and Westerners were not even close to being tolerant of other religions, but this isn't something like the Buddhist altar we saw at the Celadon mansion. It's just a guy funnily grasping at straws. Personally, I think it would have been fine to leave in, but at the very least, something like "someone help me" or "can anyone save me" would have kept the original intent a bit more intact. Next to the scared man, we talk to a woman who has some choice words about the guy she's standing next to. In Japanese, she says, "The person next to me. He's a man and yet so pitiful." What have we learned about gender references in Pokemon? That's right, they all get removed if they're negative in any way. The English localization of this dialogue is, "Look at him, he's such a coward." The idea that this guy shouldn't be scared because he's a man is completely gone. She just calls him a coward and that's it. Pitiful localization. Later, when exiting this room, we get challenged to a battle by a Rocket who in Japanese says, "Don't think you'll get away with betraying Team Rocket." The implication here, once again, is one of violence. The Japanese phrase, "tada de sumu to omona," is used, which basically means something like, "Don't think this will end without any repercussions." Just like itai me ni ao, which we talked about last time, there are strong undertones of violence in this statement, which is presumably why it was changed. In English, this sentence reads, "You dare betray Team Rocket," which removes all possible violent undertones and even changes this statement into a question for absolutely no reason. The next researcher we encounter has Japanese intro dialogue that goes, "That darn president. It's because he sent me to the Ponayatsun Guska branch that were targeted by Team Rocket." Together with his lost dialogue, which is, "The Ponayatsun Guska branch? Ah, it's deep within Russia." We see that this researcher was sent to the actual country of Russia. Now, the city that he mentions is not a real place in the original Japanese, but in the English, it's a different story. In English, this researcher says, "That rotten president. He shouldn't have sent me to the Tiksi branch." Tiksi is a real place in Russia, which makes trying to cover this up as a fictional version of our world a bit more difficult in English. As for why the name was changed, I can only assume it was because the original name was extremely long, which isn't a good reason. But even if we accept that reasoning for just a moment, why would you decide to change a fake place into a real place? It just doesn't make any sense. You literally could have written any fake name you wanted that sounded somewhat Russian and called it a day, but that's not what we got here. And now, in English Pokemon lore, it will forever be known that the actual town of Tiksi exists in the Pokemon world. In my opinion, this is a colossal mistake, purely because of the consequences this change has on the overall lore and continuity of the game. Sure, the name Russia is used in both versions of the game, but so is Kanto, which is a real region of Japan. I think the intention here was to create an alternate version of our world that has similar countries and regions, but isn't strictly based in reality. As we've seen with future Pokemon games, the trend of modeling regions after real places has continued, so I think it's fair to say this assumption is at least somewhat correct. However, by bringing in a real name of a real town, all of that has been completely undermined. We now have to believe that it's possible for actual real towns and cities to exist in Pokemon because of one tiny name change. This is why I always say to be careful about making arbitrary changes, no matter how small, because sometimes the ripple effect of a change can be much larger than you initially anticipated. A bit later, we come across one of Team Rocket's researchers pretending to be a Silph employee. When he loses in a battle to us, he says, "How did you know I was a rocket?" in English. Now, if you had to guess, do you think the original sentence here is shorter or longer than this localization? Many defenders of the localization of Pokemon Red would probably assume it was longer, but that is far from the case here. The literal translation of this researcher's Japanese dialogue would be, "Kuh, you caught me," which is about half as long as the English localization. I could have even shortened this further to something like "Kuh, busted," and still stayed really close to the original meaning here. So, why was this elongated in the English localization? And the answer is, you got me. Like we've seen many times before, there is no real reason for this change. It's just completely opinionated and arbitrary, which completely disqualifies it from being a good localization in my opinion. Next up, we have this researcher whose intro dialogue is actually fairly faithful. He says, "Enough of your silly games," which is fine. However, when he loses in Japanese, he says, "Aun," which is just a random exclamation as far as I can see. In English, however, this exclamation is changed to be, "No continues left," presumably referencing the intro game line that was localized pretty well. You do one thing right, and then immediately mess it up by completely reworking another line to connect back to the thing you translated well. I just don't get the logic here. Why not just use one of those weird and cringe exclamations you so love to use on every other exclamation here as well? At the very least, it wouldn't be a complete rewrite then. Just an absolutely abysmal change. Another Team Rocket member on this floor says, "Welcome to the 10th floor. You did well to make it this far," in Japanese. In English, this was changed to, "Welcome to the 10th floor. So good of you to join me." I'm not sure why the localizer decided to make this guy sound like an absolute tool shed in the localization, but that's what we got. In the Japanese, he seems to be just honestly complimenting the player for making it this far, but the English makes it seem like you're a terrible player for making him wait as long as he did. It's just a really weird choice that didn't accomplish anything positive in my opinion. A little bit later on our first visit to the top floor, we talk to a rocket near the room with Giovanni in it, and he says in Japanese, "Who are you? What do you want with the boss?" This was localized to, "Halt, do you have an appointment with my boss?" So yeah, they changed his entire character for no reason. In the Japanese, he's just a normal rocket who asks you in a rather brutish way what you're doing here, and in the English, he's like some kind of royal guard. This change made me realize something about the overall identity of Team Rocket, and that is that in the Japanese, it's pretty consistent that they're a group of thugs who like to threaten people and are generally your classic evil organization. In the English, on the other hand, they're all over the place. You have this guy who's a royal guard for some reason, other guys who sound too nice to be criminals, a few actual mean-sounding guys, and then a bunch of just boring nothing rockets. There's no consistency. Team Rocket seems less like a cohesive evil organization and more of a random assortment of trainers you're forced to battle in the English. Later on, we battle another rocket who says after losing, "You got lucky," in Japanese, and "cough cough" in English. I'm not really sure why the localizer thought they had to go this far with the adaptation here, but this is obviously 100% out of the scope of just some slight changes here and there. It's a completely new sentence with a completely different meaning. At least with some of the other changes we've seen, there's some semblance of commonality, but here you can't even tell these two sentences were said by the same person. It's a travesty, plain and simple. A bit down the road, we come across a room with a bunch of Pokemon reports laid out on a table. One of these reports reads, "At the Pokemon Laboratory, they succeeded in creating the man-made Pokemon Porygon in the original Japanese game." In the English localization, however, this same report reads, "Pokemon Lab created Porygon, the first virtual reality Pokemon." First of all, what does that even mean? What in the world is a virtual reality Pokemon? Like just a 3D image on a computer screen? That's not a Pokemon, it's just a bunch of pixels, and yes, I get the irony here. The original Japanese clearly wanted Porygon to be portrayed as a man-made Pokemon first and foremost, not a virtual reality Pokemon, whatever that means. In this room with the Pokemon reports, we also come across a juggler for the first time, and just like many of the other trainer types we've come across, this one saw some modification. In Japanese, jugglers are known as Jipushi Jugura, or gypsy jugglers. Presumably the term gypsy was removed because it is a rather culturally charged word. Personally, I'm not a fan of any kind of censorship during localization, so if it was me, I probably would have left this in, but that's just me. Next, we find our first Max Revive in Pokemon Red, and in Japanese they're called Genki no Katamari, or a cluster of pep. There's a bunch of different ways to translate this name, but it's basically a whole bunch of energy or motivation formed into one big mass. The English, however, is just a super basic and uninspired Max Revive. I already complained about the original Revive a while back, so I won't get into it again here, but just so you know, I hate how generic these item names are. In the same room as the max revive, we find a man hiding in the back. He says, "Tremble, tremble. I'm scared, so I'm hiding here," in the original Japanese. In the English, this becomes, "Shh, can't you see I'm hiding?" So basically, they made him a total jerk for no reason. In the original game, he just meekly says he's hiding because he's scared of Team Rocket, but in the English, it's implied that we've done something wrong that we didn't even intend to do. It really makes this guy come off as unpleasant when the exact opposite is true of the original. Just another example of the localization changing the characterization of Pokemon Red. Back towards the top of the building, we come across a woman surrounded by a bunch of beds. When we talk to her in Japanese, she says, "You seem tired. Why don't you take a rest in the nap room?" As some of you may be aware, Japan is a country where working overtime through the night is a pretty normal occurrence, especially if you work at a large company. That's why many companies have special designated nap rooms for employees to rest for just a little bit before they're forced back to work. These are called kaminshitsu, or nap rooms. Now, when it comes to the English localization here, the idea of this being a nap room was more or less removed. In English, this same woman just says, "You should take a quick nap." Of course, we can infer that this is a room for napping since it's full of beds and the woman says we should take a nap, but I still think it should have been stated outright what this room was to avoid confusion. After our quick nap, we come across a rocket who says, "Guys who get in our way are in our way," in Japanese, which is a bit of a joke sentence as you can tell. He's stating the obvious fact that someone who's in your way is getting in the way, which is meant to be funny. However, in the English, this attempt at humor was completely removed. Instead, this rocket just says, "Quit messing with us, kid." All the charm and fun of the original dialogue just gone, watered down to a completely generic and uninteresting sentence that does absolutely nothing special. Overall, just a baffling localization decision all around. After our battle with this rocket, we finally make it to our rival who has been lying in wait for us. This time he's got two new Pokemon for us to talk about, namely Alakazam and Venusaur. Alakazam is known as Fudin in Japanese, which comes from the transliteration of the name of the famous magician Harry Houdini, or Hari Fudini. Venusaur is called Fushigi Bana in Japanese, which comes from Fushigi meaning strange or mysterious, and Hana meaning flower. Both pretty straightforward names. Now, with our rival defeated, we can at long last make our way to the president's office where Giovanni awaits us. His intro dialogue is actually localized pretty faithfully as far as things go, but there's one thing towards the end that really annoyed me. In Japanese, he ends his dialogue by saying, "Itai me ni atte morau zo," which, as we've discussed, means "I'll have you feel some pain." For some reason, in this one specific instance, this was translated almost directly. The end of the English dialogue is, "or experience a world of pain." I'm not gonna lie, when I first read this, I almost lost it. We've seen time and time again this exact phrase get completely removed or brought down to a very basic level, but for some reason here it's unchanged. Just why? We've already established that the consistency in the English localization of Pokemon Red is absolute garbage, but this is just so much worse. It's such a simple thing to just stick to the rules you've set out for yourself when localizing something, but I guess maybe the localizer here just didn't care about that. Moving on to Giovanni's lost quote, he says, "To think I would lose," in Japanese, and "I lost again," in English. I'm not quite sure why the English localizer felt the need to make a reference back to Giovanni's previous loss when that wasn't in the original, but whatever the case may be, this is a horrible localization. There's also a few more small things I'd like to mention about the conversation we have with Giovanni after the battle. For one thing, he starts off in Japanese by saying, "Darn, it can't be helped. I'll give up on Silph for now." This was localized to, "You ruined our plans for Silph." In the Japanese, it's pretty clear that Giovanni still intends to take over Silph Company, but he's just being forced to retreat for now. In the English, however, it seems like he's completely given up on the idea. As to why this was changed, your guess is as good as mine. One last thing about this interaction with Giovanni. At the very end, he says, "Well then, I shall take my leave," in Japanese, which became, "I must go, but I shall return," in English. I just don't get it. Why would you completely ruin the surprise that Giovanni comes back as the final gym leader by very obviously hinting at his return? There was absolutely no good reason for this change, and the consequences of it just make the game worse, so I just can't understand why it was done. Not only is it a really random and arbitrary thing to add in, but it also completely destroys the surprise the developers laid out for us towards the end of the game. It's just bad, plain and simple. And now to end things out for this episode, after we get the Master Ball from the Silph president, we speak with his secretary who says, "Thank you for saving us. The president and I are full of gratitude," in Japanese. The English localization of this is, "Thank you for rescuing all of us. We admire your courage." So yet again, we see a clear example of a completely opinionated and arbitrary change. There was no reason this had to be changed, and yet it was, because the localizer just felt like it. That seems to be the story of this entire game, doesn't it? And with that, we close the book on yet another exciting episode of a localized journey through Pokemon Red. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode as well. If you did by chance happen to enjoy it, consider giving the video a like. It's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks as always for watching, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Ack out.